to go over just like one or two other sort of helpful lighting things, specifically for animations. And then after that, you guys can go. I'll also stay, because I had like a few people ask about weight painting stuff. So I'll do like an optional sort of bonus thing on weight painting at the end of class. If you want to stay for that, you're welcome to. All right, so basic 3-point lighting setup. If anybody cares, I'm using, just like as a weird demo head, I'm using this file from the sample models. It is called Self-Caricature Low Poly UVs. So if you want to follow along, this is the file that I'm using. I'm just going to go ahead and be really lazy and just mesh combine these dudes and pull them up and add in a ground plane. Super fancy. All right, so basic premise of a 3-point light setup, and also my usual disclaimer, you should be rendering with like Arnold or Redshift or one of the quote-unquote nice renderers. If you're doing in-game rendering, do whatever makes sense for that. But you should also, so like for Maya, I'll be demoing this in Arnold because it's here, and frankly I hate installing Redshift. But make sure just like use whatever lights are under the, like in this case Arnold drop tab. For your lighting, don't use the lights from like the rendering tab here. These are really gross, not physically accurate old Maya lights from like years ago, and they're gross, so please don't use them. So anywho, basic premise of 3-point light setup is that you have one light that's going to do like the main lighting on your object and light most of it. That's your key light. Where am I going? Area light. And then there is another light to sort of fill in any dark shadows, and then an optional third light to sort of like punch the object out from the background. So I'm just going to go ahead and open the render view for the Arnolds. Hurrah. So just also, in case you guys didn't know, you can actually look through your lights as if they were a camera. And that will also reposition them. So if you select your light and then go to Panels, look through Selected, I'm now actually looking on the inside of my light, and it's probably, oh, there you go, you can kind of tell. So I don't know where the heck I'm actually looking right now, but it'll, based on where you move the light, you can see that that's actually like changing the light position in the render. So it can be a really easy way to sort of like, if you have sort of like spotlight sort of shape, to shine that on a character rather than like trying to move it through space tediously forever. So obviously this light is really dark. Does anybody remember the difference between intensity and exposure?
Exposure multiplies
Yes.
The intensity or something?
Yeah, it's like exponential versus linear. Yeah, so intensity, which used to be all that existed, is basically linear. So like if the intensity is 1 and you raise it to 2, your light gets twice as bright. If you set the intensity to 10, your light is 10 times brighter than it originally was. Exposure works exponentially, and I realized last class I'm terrible at describing what exponential means. But basically, if you set the exposure to something like 1, it's going to basically do 2 times brighter. If you set the exposure to 2, it's going to do 2 times 2, so it's technically 4 times brighter than it originally was. If I set this to 10, I don't know what math number that comes out to, but like this is an exposure of 10 versus, let me set intensity back to 10 and this back to 0, versus intensity of 10. So you can see there's like a really dramatic difference. Functionally, they both do exactly the same thing. You can get the same light intensity with both of these. Exposure is just sort of a little bit, I guess, more real-worldy in the way that like actual lights and actual cameras work. And then you can also get brighter values without having to input crazy high numbers. So I know like it's when I was lighting stuff, it wasn't uncommon for me to bump this up to something like 10,000 or something crazy. Like if you don't want to do that, you can get sort of brighter stuff with exposure without needing to plug in, 6 zeros behind every number. Any questions on any of that? All right, fair enough. All right, so I'm just going to position this light. So the basic point of the key light is to, again, provide light to most of the model. So I'm just going to go ahead and maybe bump the exposure up something perhaps like that, and say, all right, that's like kind of not terrible, I guess, for like the main light on this face. But you'll notice that there's also, on the other side of the face, there's like a crap ton of a lot of extremely dark shadows. The hair is blending into the non-existent background, so you just like can't see anything because it's black. And that's where the fill light comes in. So I'm just gonna go to Arnold, Lights, and then just create another area light. And also disclaimer, so like this can be used as a standalone light setup to just like light an object, or you can use this something similar with like HDRIs. I actually, until I started teaching, I'm not gonna lie, I never used an HDRI for anything. I did all of my own custom lighting because I'm a spaz. So, yeah. So I don't really care like how you guys choose to light your scene. I just want it to like look decent, and that's kind of all I want. So I'm just gonna go through because I like must label my lights or else I lose my mind. My weird thing I do is I usually turn the light I'm working with like a weird color just so I can see exactly what it's doing. Like I think the blue kind of helps to separate it from the original light. So I'm just gonna go in and maybe sort of like push away some of the shadows from the side of the face. I kind of like some, I guess, but not all. So like you see now it's just like, again, a little bit brighter, a little bit more definition on that side of the head. I do usually then will like swap my light back to white because I can't tell what's happening with the blue. And also like just like, in case you've never noticed, I really like weird light colors. So that my only weird disclaimer is like if you use this really dark blue, it's extremely hard to tell what the heck you're actually doing. So I usually will go with something like brighter obnoxious like yellow, or like this other light blue seems to kind of hold the values pretty well. So this is like more or less the minimum you can do for lighting. It does, it lights your object. Nothing's falling into like complete total shadow. I usually do like to add a little rim light though, and that's basically just gonna like highlight the edge of this face and kind of go through and like pop it from the background a little bit. So I'm gonna add a third light, just area light like I've been doing before. And I'll just call that rim light. And once again, I'm gonna do panels, look through selected, and look at that. And then this one, I usually end up just making it absurdly bright, like with an exposure of like 10 or something crazy, because otherwise I feel like I can never figure out like where it's actually, like where I'm actually looking. But you can see like as I sort of move this around, we do get that sort of nice little line like just on the edge of the hair, which helps sort of, again, pop it out from the background a little bit. Also, did any of you guys know you can undo camera moves? There's a button for that. If you do Alt-Z, it will move your camera. It's like literally just like an undo button for your camera. And apparently, I've never tried it, but Alt-Y will redo your camera moves. So that can be kind of helpful. Like I always actually accidentally move things without meaning to. But anywho, that's the basic premise of a 3-point light setup. If you are so inclined, you can go through and like make your lights really weird colors, which is usually what I end up doing because I'm, like I said, nuts and I have a bad aesthetic. But it is actually, so this is like obviously very extreme, but usually it is good to not just use white lights if you're adding in like additional lights in your scene. So maybe do something with like, a little bit of like warmth to it or something like that. You can also use the color temperature thing, and this will give you a nice slider of sort of realistic light ranges based on like real world values of like how color temperature actually works. The limitation of that is, if you're trying to light a fish tank, it does not go up to that level of blue. But yeah, that's pretty much that. Any questions on basic 3-point light setup before I nip into light linking and like the one or two other weird little tidbits I have? All right, huzzah. So this is like actually my terrible color aesthetic. I kind of like this. So all right, the other thing I wanted to go over is light linking. And I know I went over this, I think, with some of my CGI classes. I want to go over it again really quick. Let's jump back into my perspective camera. So light linking is basically a way to control what light affects a certain object. So like in this case, I think it's a little bit weird how I'm not super in love with like how the rim light is casting this enormous blue shadow in the front of my scene. So like I could basically turn that off if I wanted to. So if you go into Windows, relationship editors, and light linking. This is again Windows, relationship editors, light linking. Grab either of these menus. They both do exactly the same thing. It's just a different way to select stuff. So I'm just going to select light centric. And you'll see that it gives you basically a list of all of the lights in your scene and all of the geometry that it can be affected by the light. So this will, if you have like groups of stuff, it'll hold your groups together. But basically, if I select, I want to, again, turn my rim light off on the ground. So I'll select my rim light, and you'll see that like anything that that light is affecting is highlighted blue. If I click off, just like click on my ground plane, it should, sometimes it doesn't update the render, so you just need to like reopen your render window. But you can see that once I've deselected this ground plane, it's actually, that light is no longer affecting it at all. So I can turn that back on with light, without light. I could turn it off on the head if I only wanted a very blue ground plane. And you can go through and do this with like any of your lights. So a lot of times I'll use it for like my, this is actually probably one of the least horrible rim lights I've ever made before. Normally they are extremely bright and have like really aggressive shadows, and I usually will turn them off on the ground plane because I think the shadow is off-putting. But you can go through and again, like just do weird tweaks like this if you need to. If you feel like one object is maybe not quite lit enough, and you need to get like a really bright light for that affects something else, you can just shamelessly turn that off. One thing that's actually really common to do for this is, you know, if you're watching animated movies, the characters always have those really nice, like specular highlight little white dots in their eyeballs. There are many times dedicated lights that are linked only to the eyes that will literally just follow the character's eyes around, so there's always that nice specular highlight in it. And it's like one of those weird sort of like rendering hacks that you can do in CG that you can't do in real life, but it's not at all uncommon. So this is basically the light-centric version. It just shows on a per light basis everything that affects it. If you need to work on a specific object itself, you could do the object-centric version. And you'll see, like, again, same basic options, but this time I have to click on geometry, and then I can check on or off whatever lights affect that. So you can use this. I would say if you're going to use light linking, just like pay attention to what you're doing. Make sure that it still kind of looks real-worldy-ish, because like obviously I could turn off all of the lights on the base so that it's only getting bounce light from the character, which doesn't look realistic at all. So like try to avoid crazy stuff like that, but it's a really, really handy tool. If you're just looking to light a certain area, or like again, if you have some like weird light bleed on something that you don't want, you can just like turn off the light on that particular object. Any questions on light linking? All right. As far as I'm aware, there's no way to sort of, there's no way to like key light linking on and off that I'm aware of. You can also sort of do, so like, say I really like the rim light on the top of this character's head, but I really am not a fan of like how blue the ground plane is. You can do kind of like a weird thing, which is like add 2 lights in and use light linking to get the effect you want. So in this case, I'm going to say the ground, I'm going to turn off the rim light for it, and I'm going to actually duplicate an additional rim light. And for that rim light, I would like the ground affected by that. So I'll do rim backup. And then I'm just going to take the exposure down on that a little bit, so I have render faster or not. All right, I might need to refresh my render. So basically I'm going to use that additional light if it's okay. And of course it's going to be a jerk because duplicating lights like never works. All right, so I'm just going to make a new area light, parent that under my rim light, go ahead and zero the values out for that, and it should put the light directly under my rim light. At which point then I would also go through and like, again, just tweak the, hopefully this is like, what? All right, so we have horrendous green light in here, fantastic. All right, so set the exposure to something. So like, this is perhaps, you know, a little bit nicer than what I had before with the blue, where you see like a little bit of it, but it's not overpowering the entire front of the scene. So what you could do is, again, just turn the for the ground, make sure that that area light is affecting the second little ground light I put in. And then just go to the character and make sure that that second light is not affecting the character itself. Honestly, you could leave it. It didn't really seem to do all that much. But it's just, again, sort of a way to justify, like, I don't want a super blown out ground, but it looks insane maybe to have like a crazy bright highlight here and no effect on the ground plane. So there's like lots of weird stuff you can do in CG with like 8 different lights to get like the very specific effect you want. And light linking can also potentially help to reduce your render times, kind of. Where, you know, the fewer things a light has to interact with, the faster it's going to render. I don't usually use it as a tool for messing with render times, but it is a thing that can be done. That's basically my bit on light linking. Other kind of interesting thing that I actually only learned about recently, if you go to Windows, Rendering Editors, Light Editor, it just gives you a list of literally all of the lights in your scene and their basic values for stuff like exposure. So you can edit, if you're just like looking to make crazy like bulk edits to stuff, you can do that here really easily without having to like find each light in your outliner. And mostly just do stuff for like samples, exposure, intensity, color. But it is like quite organized, honestly, and very nice. It also gives you like quick previews of all of the settings for all of your lights. So that's just kind of handy. And again, that's, let's see, Windows, Rendering Editors, and Light Editors where you found that. Any questions on any of that before we move on? All right. So I think, just like double check my notes really quick. All right, cool. All right, so I think pretty much the only other thing that I have to go over is the stats for specific objects. So in case you guys weren't aware, let me actually really quick make a just obnoxiously shiny sphere because, shoot. See when you like accidentally move your render camera and then you're like, oh crap, I need to go back. You can do a Alt-Z. Also, disclaimer, like if you're rendering with Arnold, use Arnold shaders. I'm just gonna do a preset for Chrome, replace, array, and Alt-Z back to my original camera angle. So, fantastic. We have a person with a shiny sphere. So guys, in case you guys weren't aware, you can also edit specific render qualities or like specific render features for a given mesh. So if I click on my object here and go into the shape node, go under, there's like sort of 2 places to access some of the stuff. You can do it with render stats and you can also do it with Arnold. My default thing is like if I'm working with Arnold, I'll try the Arnold tab, and if that doesn't do what I want, I'll go to render stats. But it is, again, if you're using a dedicated renderer, it's usually good to use like their tabs for stuff. So this is incidentally where you would also go to like check your object if you wanted it to not be opaque and you were trying to make it like glass with a see-through shadow. This is the button you'd want to check for that. But you can also turn off a bunch of other settings if you've never played with them. Like you can turn off visibility in the render. So you can see that like it's still rendering shadows. It's still showing up in the reflection. The object itself just doesn't exist in the render. So you can turn that off. You can turn off cast shadows. That's going to get rid of any shadow that is cast by the object, including, I think, shadows that are cast on the object. Shadows that the object is casting on itself. So like areas like around the hair and the nose will also affect that. If you want to turn off, you can also turn off self shadows, which is cast shadows on other objects, just not yourself, if you want to get that specific, I guess, with your renders. I've never really had a reason to do that, honestly. I'm thinking maybe if you were trying to do some kind of like ghost or something like that, it might make sense. But I usually don't worry about that too much. The other thing you can do is turn off like diffuse reflections, which usually I find doesn't do a whole lot. I can turn off specular reflections. So if I don't want the object to show up in my sphere, again, check off specular reflections, you're good to go. And then you can also turn off the diffuse and specular transmissions, I believe are stuff for global illumination. So like the light hits the object and then it bounces off onto the ground. If you remember from a few renders ago where I actually turned off all the lights on the ground, there was still like kind of a little halo around the object. That is what the like diffuse transmission would be, is that bounce light for diffuse colors. So you can turn off like all, you can mess with these as you need. Maybe doing something like the specular reflection would be interesting where for like the bouncing ball assignments, like some people had some like really shiny objects and you could see your objects not moving in the back of the screen. So you can turn that off just to sort of help keep the illusion of your renders. And these values are, I've never actually found a huge reason to do it, but you can key them if you need to. So like I'm going to do primary visibility. I'm just going to kind of go to frame 40. If you right click it, you can do set key, and then I'll go to frame 41, check it off, right, and I'm doing the ground plane. Let's go for it. And I'll set the key on that. So you'll notice that, like, again, if I scrub before the frame, ground shows up, then it doesn't. So you can kind of like mess with things like that if you just need something to like suddenly turn on. You'll also notice that like this is one of those annoying attributes that is not noted in the time slider or on the object or on the attribute itself. So that's really annoying. You can find the keyframes in your graph editor. So Windows, Animation Editor's graph editor. If you click on that ground plane, you will notice that they do actually have the keyframes there for primary visibility. I found that you can move them. Changing the values does pretty much nothing. But if you ever need to like get rid of the keyframe or something like that, you can do that through the graph editor, and that is the only place I've ever been able to access those keys. So other reasons why you might want to use this is, I'm thinking if you're looking for like creepy shadows for something, but you don't want that object visible. You know, if you have like a creepy like person, or you're trying to do like a Peter Pan kind of effect where like there's just a shadow running around, you could animate the character like normal and then just turn off primary visibility, and then it'll go through and actually render pretty much everything except, like it'll render all the shadows, but not the character. You can also use this, so like, usually I don't turn off cast shadows, but you could do it if you have maybe a background object and you realized it was shining a really strange shadow on your scene. If it wasn't terribly obvious, you could just quick and easy fix, turn off cast shadows, and then like not have that shadow affecting your object. So that's like also one thing where like, again, you like check for that as you do your test renders, and if that becomes an issue, instead of moving your object, you can just sort of turn off shadows for it. But that's basically and Arnold or Redshift has like a pretty much the same thing for that as well. That's pretty much that. Are there any questions on that? All right. The only other thing that I want to go over, and it's less of a demo, like super brief, don't be afraid. Like if you throw in an HDRI, and maybe there's like certain areas in it where your characters are moving where it's really dark, you can totally, again, do weird stuff in animation. Like, if I wanted to, I could take all of these lights, group them together, and then just parent them to my character, so that as I move my character around the scene, it takes the lights with them. Or at least it should. For some reason, it seems to be giving me some brighter intensities. It's a little weird. Basically, like, you can move your lights with your characters. And again, so the reasons like you might want to do that is, again, like specular highlights on eyeballs is a common thing people use this for. I'm also thinking if you're walking through if you have like a dimly lit alley where there's like lots of street lamps and your character is just sort of like going between them, and getting maybe a little bit too dark, you could just attach a really, really dim light to your character. So that not enough to like light up the background, but just enough to sort of make your character visible, and just have that following them around. But yeah, that is actually pretty much all of the lighting stuff that I have for you guys today. Other suggestion is just like, if you're using an HDRI in a closed room with like a single window in it, put a portal light in. It's going to make your renders less sampley and render faster. Portal lights are great. If you're doing an outdoor scene, you don't need to use them. But yeah. Any questions on lighting or anything else before I free you guys and then do the bonus thing on weight painting? All right then. In that case, If you're not interested in weight painting, be free. If you are interested in weight painting or like other rigging stuff, hang out here and we can do some more on that. Is everybody interested? Because I will happily redo things. Okay, cool. Well, that was actually very unexpected.